Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us once again here at the Crime Folio, where we examine the documents of darkness and the stories they tell. Most killers operate in the shadows, their identity a secret they guard with their lives. But there is another breed of predator, one driven by a profound and narcissistic need to be heard. They do not just kill, they communicate. They write letters, they send ciphers, they taunt the police and terrorize the public. Their words become a part of the crime itself, a manifesto of their madness. Tonight, we read the words of the killers who chose to speak. Case 1. The Zodiac Killer's Ciphers. The story begins on a lonely, dark stretch of road, a place where teenage lovers sought privacy and found only a terrifying, final silence. Lake Herman Road on the outskirts of Vallejo, California, was such a place. On the cold night of December 20th, 1968, two high school students, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were parked in a gravel turnout. It was their first official date. They were likely sharing a quiet, innocent moment, their world contained within the steamed-up windows of David's Rambler station wagon. They were unaware of the second car that pulled up beside them, or of the figure that emerged from it, a figure who would, in a few brutal moments, extinguish their young lives and introduce a new and terrifying phantom into the American consciousness. The killer's actions were swift and brutally efficient. He shot David once in the head as he sat in the car. Betty Lou managed to scramble out, but she didn't get far. She was shot 5 times in the back as she fled. The crime was senseless, motiveless, and terrifyingly random. The Vallejo Police Department was baffled. They had no witnesses, no suspects, and no clear reason for the execution of 2 teenagers. For 7 months, the case remained a frustrating, tragic mystery, a dark spot on the soul of the small community. Then, on July 31st, 1969, the killer decided to introduce himself. Identical letters arrived at the offices of 3 prominent Northern California newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. The letters were written in a strange, blocky hand, filled with spelling errors and a chilling, boastful tone. Each letter began with the same declaration: "This is the murderer of the 2 teenagers' last Christmas at Lake Herman." But the author was not just taking credit for a past crime. He was announcing a new one. He detailed the murder of another young couple, Darlene Farron and Michael Mageau, who had been shot just weeks earlier on July 4th, in a park just a few miles from the first crime scene. Darlene had died. Michael had survived, providing the first description of their attacker. The letters contained details that only the killer could have known, proving their authenticity beyond any doubt. The phantom now had a voice, but it was the postscript to these letters that would define his legacy and set the terms of his twisted game with the public. Each letter contained 1/3 of a 408-symbol cryptogram. The killer demanded that the newspapers publish his cipher on their front pages. If they failed to comply, he promised to go on a kill rampage. "I will cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night," he wrote, "then move on to kill again until I have killed over a dozen people." He signed his letters not with a name, but with a symbol, a circle with a crosshairs overlaid on it. It was a stark, menacing logo, like the sight on a rifle. The Zodiac Killer had named himself. He was no longer just a murderer, he was a brand, a symbol of random, intelligent terror. The newspapers, after consulting with law enforcement and weighing the ethical dilemma, complied. They published the ciphers. The entire San Francisco Bay Area was now a captive audience in the killer's deadly performance. The cipher became a public obsession. Amateur sleuths, cryptographers, and concerned citizens across the state poured over the strange symbols, desperate to unlock the killer's mind. Just over a week later, the cipher was solved. It was not cracked by the FBI or a team of seasoned cryptanalysts, but by a humble high school teacher from Salinas, Donald Hardin, and his wife, Betty. The decoded message was not a confession or a clue to the killer's identity. It was something far more disturbing, a glimpse into his sick and grandiose fantasy. I like killing people because it is so much fun. The message began, the capitalization a shout from the page. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all to kill. Something gives me the most thrilling experience. The best part of it is Tichai, when I die I will be reborn in paradise and Tichai I have killed will become my slaves. He refused to give his name, stating it would slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. The manifesto was a chilling piece of psychological theater. It revealed a killer driven not by rage or greed, but by a god complex, a man who saw other human beings as mere trophies for a paradise of his own invention. The Zodiac did not wait for his next letter to instill more terror. On September 27, 1969, he chose a new, even more idyllic stage for his next act. The serene shores of Lake Berryessa in Napa County. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, two college students, were picnicking on a secluded peninsula. They saw a man approaching them from the trees. He was dressed in one of the most bizarre and terrifying costumes in the history of crime. He wore a dark, hooded executioner's tunic, emblazoned with his crosshair symbol. His face was concealed by a sack-like hood with clip-on sunglasses over the eyeholes. He carried a large, bayonet-style knife and a pistol. He approached them calmly. He told them he was an escaped convict from a prison in Montana and needed their car and money to flee to Mexico. The story was a lie, a piece of theater to disarm them. After tying them up with pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline, his demeanor changed. "I'm going to have to stab you people," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. He then brutally stabbed both of them, repeatedly with the long knife. Brian was stabbed 6 times in the back, Cecilia 10 times. After the savage attack, the killer walked calmly back to Brian's car. He took a black felt-tip pen and drew his crosshair symbol on the car door. Beneath it, he wrote the dates of his previous attacks and the current one, signing it with the date and the time, adding a final, chilling detail, "by knife." He then walked away, leaving the 2 students for dead. He drove to a payphone in Napa and placed a call to the police dispatcher. "I want to report a murderno, a double murder," he said, his voice a low, controlled monotone. He gave the location of the crime and then added, "I'm the one who did it." Miraculously, Brian Hartnell survived. He was able to provide police with a detailed account of the attack and a description of the killer's voice and mannerisms. Cecilia Shepard clung to life for 2 days before succumbing to her injuries. The Zodiac had once again communicated, not with a letter, but with a crime scene he had personally signed. Just 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, the Zodiac brought his terror from the secluded countryside into the heart of San Francisco itself. He took a cab driven by a man named Paul Stein. At the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets, in the affluent Presidio Heights neighborhood, he shot Stein once in the back of the head, killing him instantly. 3 teenagers across the street witnessed the immediate aftermath. They saw the killer in the front seat wiping down the cab. They called the police. The initial radio dispatch mistakenly reported that the suspect was a black man. When the first 2 officers arrived on the scene, they saw a white man walking away from the area, but because he didn't match the broadcast description, they didn't stop him. It was a catastrophic blunder. The Zodiac, it is believed, had just walked right past the police and disappeared into the night. Days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. "This is the Zodiac speaking." It began, "I am the murderer of the taxi driver. I am the same man who did in the people in the North Bay area." To prove it, the envelope contained a piece of irrefutable, grisly evidence. A swatch of cloth cut from Paul Stein's blood-soaked shirt. The killer then launched into a long, rambling taunt, mocking the police for their incompetence. "The SF police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly instead of holding road races with their motorcycles to see who could make the most noise," he wrote. He ended the letter with a new threat, one that sent a wave of panic through the city. He threatened to shoot the children on a school bus. "Just shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out," he wrote. A chillingly specific and sadistic fantasy. This was the peak of the Zodiac's reign of terror. He was no longer just a killer. He was a media sensation, a boogeyman who held the entire Bay Area hostage. He continued his campaign of communication for several more years, sending a stream of taunting letters and complex ciphers to the newspapers. He claimed to have killed as many as 37 people, though only 7 victims are definitively linked to him. One cipher, a 340-character puzzle, remained unsolved for 51 years, finally being cracked in 2020 by a team of amateur codebreakers. Its message, like the first, was a boastful, rambling diatribe that offered no clues to his identity. The investigation into the Zodiac was one of the most extensive and frustrating in California history. Dozens of suspects were investigated. The most famous was a man named Arthur Lee Allen, a former schoolteacher with a history of sexual misconduct and a fascination with weapons. The circumstantial evidence against him was compelling. He owned a Zodiac brand watch, the same brand the killer named himself after. He wore the same size shoe as a footprint found at the Lake Berryessa crime scene. He had reportedly spoken of killing people and writing taunting letters, but the evidence was never conclusive. His fingerprints and DNA did not match the partial samples recovered from the letters and crime scenes. He died in 1992, taking his secrets, if he had any, to the grave. After 1974, the letters from the Zodiac stopped. The phantom who had terrorized a region, who had played a deadly game with the press and the police, simply fell silent. He vanished as completely as he had first appeared on that dark road in Vallejo. The case remains officially open, a permanent and frustrating monument to a killer who was defined not just by his crimes, but by his words. The Zodiac Killer's manifesto was not a coherent ideology. It was a performance of ego. He killed to create a story, and then he wrote himself into the starring role. He was a murderer who wanted to be an author, and in the end, his greatest and most terrifying achievement was creating a story that has no final chapter. Case 2. The Son of Sam, David Berkowitz's Letters. From the cryptic intellectual games of the Zodiac, our folio now turns to a different kind of manifesto, one born not of ciphers, but of a raw, howling madness that held the city of New York in its grip. The stage for this new theater of terror was not the misty hills of Northern California, but the sweltering, concrete labyrinth of New York City in the mid-1970s. It was a city on its knees, bankrupt, grimy, and simmering with a tension that felt as oppressive as the summer heat. In this volatile crucible, a new phantom would emerge, a killer who would speak directly to the city's fears, not just with a gun, but with a pen. He would give himself a name that would become synonymous with a summer of paranoia, a name whispered from the gutters, the Son of Sam. The story begins in the Bronx, on the night of July 29, 1976. 2 teenage girls, Donna Loria and Jody Valenti, were sitting in Jody's parked Oldsmobile, chatting after a night out. It was a scene of perfect, suburban normalcy. A man approached the car, a figure emerging from the shadows. He raised a pistol and, without a word, fired 5 shots into the car. Donna Loria was killed instantly. Jody Valenti was wounded but survived. The attack was swift, brutal, and utterly without motive. The New York City Police Department, NYPD, was faced with a seemingly random, senseless murder. They had few leads. The shooter had simply melted back into the vast, anonymous landscape of the city. For the next several months, the city moved on, the murder of Donna Loria a tragic but isolated statistic in a city accustomed to violence. But the killer was not finished. He was patient. On October 23rd, another young couple, Carl Denaro and Rosemary Keenan, were shot while sitting in a parked car in Queens. Both survived, though Denaro was seriously wounded. Again, the attack was unprovoked, the shooter a fleeting shadow. The weapon used was a powerful .44 caliber handgun, specifically a Charter Arms Bulldog revolver, a detail that would become the killer's ballistic signature. The pattern was beginning to form, a constellation of violence that the police were slowly starting to connect. The targets were young people, often in parked cars, attacked in the late hours of the night. On November 27th, 2 more teenagers, Donna DeMazy and Joan Lomino, were shot while sitting on a porch in Queens. Both were wounded. Then, on January 30th, 1977, the killer struck again, shooting a young couple, Christine Freund and John Deal, as they sat in their car after leaving a tavern. Christine was killed. The city was now on edge. The newspapers began to run stories about the .44 caliber killer, a phantom who was stalking the lovers' lanes of the outer boroughs. The randomness of the attacks was their most terrifying feature. Anyone at any time could be his next victim. The police formed a massive task force, Operation Omega, bringing together hundreds of detectives from across the city. They were hunting a ghost. They had ballistics evidence linking the crimes, and a vague physical description of a white male, but little else. The killer seemed to be operating in a void, his motives as invisible as his face. Then, on April 17, 1977, the killer decided to break his silence. He chose as his victims two more young people, Alexander Esau and Valentina Suriani, who were shot and killed while sitting in their car in the Bronx, just blocks from where the first murder had occurred. But this time, the killer left something behind. Near the bodies, he left a single, handwritten letter. It was addressed to the captain of the NYPD's 8th Homicide District, Joseph Borelli. This was the moment the .44 caliber killer became the son of Sam. The manifesto had begun. The letter was a bizarre, rambling document, a window into a deeply disturbed mind. It was written in a blocky, almost childlike script, filled with misspellings and strange punctuation. It began with a taunt. "I am deeply hurt by your calling me a women hater. I am not, but I am a monster." He gave himself his new, chilling moniker. "I am the son of Sam," he wrote, explaining that his name was a reference to a demonic force that was commanding him. "Sam loves to drink blood," he explained. "Go out and kill commands Father Sam." The letter was a work of calculated terror. It was a direct communication with the police, a boastful declaration of his power. He claimed to be a soldier, a behemoth who could not be stopped. He ended the letter with a promise of more violence and a final, chilling message for the police. "Police, let me haunt you with these words. I'll be back. I'll be back," to be interpreted as bang, 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 ugh. "Yours in murder, Mr. Monster." The NYPD, faced with a killer who was now actively engaging with them, made a difficult decision. They chose to release parts of the letter to the public, hoping it might generate a lead, that someone might recognize the handwriting or the strange phrasing. The effect was electrifying. The city, which had been living in a state of quiet dread, now had a name for its boogeyman. The son of Sam became a media sensation, a figure of almost mythical terror. The fear was no longer just about a random shooter. It was about a taunting, intelligent monster who believed he was on a mission from a demon. The killer reveled in the attention. The city's fear was his fuel. He decided to escalate his performance, to find a more public stage for his manifesto. He chose as his new correspondent the one person who could give him the biggest audience: Jimmy Breslin, the pugnacious, legendary columnist for the New York Daily News. Breslin was the voice of the city's streets, a man who wrote with a raw, gritty poetry that captured the soul of New York. He was the perfect partner for the killer's macabre dialogue. On May 30th, 1977, a letter arrived at the Daily News, addressed to Breslin. The handwriting was the same as the letter found at the Bronx crime scene. It began, "Hello from the gutters of NYC, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine, and blood." The killer was setting the scene, casting himself as a creature born from the city's own decay. He praised Breslin's work, acknowledging him as a kindred spirit of the streets. Then, he launched into a new series of taunts and threats. He referred to his victims as pretty girls, confirming that his targets were not random. He mocked the police task force. "What have you got, 1,000 detectives?" he wrote. "What will you have when I get finished?" He spoke of his love for his work. "I am a spirit roaming the night. I love my work." He again referenced his demonic master, Sam, telling Breslin to tell Papa Sam that I'm a good boy and that I will honor his commands. The letter was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was intimate and terrifying, a direct message from the killer to the city he was terrorizing. He even offered a hint about his next attack. "Police cars are stalking me," he wrote, "but I will outfox them. I'm going to be in your neighborhood next." He concluded with a series of unsettling, almost poetic questions. What will we have for tomorrow? The public should know. To the people of Queens, I love you. I am the monster. I am the son of Sam. The Daily News, after consulting with the police, made the decision to publish the letter. The headline screamed from newsstands across the city. "Son of Sam's latest letter. I'll be back." The effect was a citywide panic attack. The letter transformed the son of Sam from a simple killer into a pop culture phenomenon of pure terror. The city's nightlife ground to a halt. Discos emptied out. Women with long, dark hair rushed to salons to cut it short or dye it blonde. The lovers' lanes, once a haven for young couples, were now deserted, haunted by the specter of the .44 caliber killer. The city was in a self-imposed lockdown, held hostage by a series of letters from a man no one could find. The police were under immense pressure. The mayor, Abraham Beame, who was in the middle of a tough re-election campaign, promised that no resource would be spared. The Omega Task Force swelled to over 300 detectives, the largest manhunt in the city's history. They chased down thousands of leads. They analyzed the letters for psychological clues, noting the killer's apparent intelligence mixed with a profound sense of persecution and grandiosity. They knew they were looking for a narcissist, a man who craved recognition. The killer struck again on June 26th, wounding 2 more people, Judy Placido and Sal Lupo, as they left a disco in Queens. Then, for a month, there was silence. The city held its breath through a sweltering July, marked by a citywide blackout that plunged New York into a night of looting and chaos. The sense of a city on the verge of collapse was palpable. The son of Sam seemed to be a symptom of a larger disease, a monster born from a society that was falling apart. The final act of the Son of Sam saga came on July 31, 1977. In the Bath Beach neighborhood of Brooklyn, Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante, 2 20-year-olds, were on their first date. They were parked in Robert's car under a streetlight. Stacy had beautiful, long blonde hair, a departure from the killer's usual victim type. The killer approached the car, raised his .44 bulldog and fired 4 times. Robert was shot in the face, losing his left eye. Stacy was shot in the head. She would die in the hospital a few hours later. She was the final victim. But in this last, brutal act, the killer made his first and only mistake. He had chosen his location poorly. It was a well-lit residential street. A local woman walking her dog saw him. She saw him get into a car, a yellow Ford Galaxy, and drive away. More importantly, as he was leaving the scene, he was blocked by another car, and a police officer, noticing his illegally parked vehicle, had written him a parking ticket. It was a small, routine act of civic enforcement, a bureaucratic detail in the middle of a night of terror. It would be the clue that would unravel everything. The police, now with a fresh witness and a new lead, focused on the parking ticket. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Detectives began the painstaking, monumental task of tracking down every single car that had been issued a parking ticket in that neighborhood on that night. They ran the license plates, they checked registrations. The work was slow, methodical, and tedious. A few days later, a detective in Yonkers, a suburb just north of New York City, received a call from a woman who was concerned about her neighbor. She reported that the man who lived in the apartment below her, a quiet postal worker named David Berkowitz, had been acting strangely. He had recently shot her dog, a black Labrador retriever named Harvey. The owner of that dog was a man named Sam Carr. The detective filed the report, but the name Sam rang a bell. The parking ticket lead finally bore fruit. One of the tickets was issued to a yellow Ford Galaxy registered to David Berkowitz of Yonkers. The 2 separate leads, the neighbor's call and the parking ticket, had converged on a single name. The net was closing. On August 10, 1977, A team of NYPD detectives drove to Yonkers and set up surveillance outside the apartment building at 35 Pine Street. They saw the yellow Ford Galaxy parked outside. They waited. Late that evening, a man emerged from the building, carrying a paper bag. He got into his car. The detectives surrounded the vehicle, their guns drawn. Detective John Falotico approached the driver's side window. "Police," he said. "Don't move." The man looked at him, a slight, almost serene smile on his face. "Well," he said, his voice calm. "You got me." "Who are you?" the detective asked. "I'm Sam," he replied. "David Berkowitz." Inside the paper bag, they found the .44 caliber Bulldog revolver. The manhunt that had terrorized the city for over a year was over. The monster had been unmasked, and he was not a demon from the gutters. He was a quiet, lonely 24-year-old postal worker. In his confession, Berkowitz spun the elaborate tale that had been the foundation of his letters. He claimed that his neighbor, Sam Carr, was a demonic entity, and that his dog, Harvey, was a vessel for an ancient demon who had commanded him to kill. It was a story of supernatural possession, a manifesto of madness. But to psychologists and investigators, the truth was more mundane and, in its own way, more tragic. David Berkowitz was a deeply disturbed young man, an adopted child who had grown up feeling isolated and powerless. He was plagued by feelings of inadequacy and a burning resentment against a world he felt had rejected him, particularly against women. The murders, and more importantly, the letters, were his way of seizing power. He couldn't be a successful lover or a powerful man in his real life, but as the son of Sam, he could be a god. He could hold an entire city in the palm of his hand, dictating its fears, commanding its attention. The letters were not a byproduct of his crimes. They were the point. He was not a servant of a demon named Sam. He was the author of his own terrifying myth, a character he had created to finally make the world see him. David Berkowitz pleaded guilty to 6 murders and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be free again. His capture brought an end to the Summer of Sam, a season of fear that remains etched in the memory of New York City. His case is a chilling testament to the power of a narrative. The manifesto he wrote, scribbled in a desperate hand and sent to the press, was more than a confession. It was a weapon, a tool of psychological warfare that proved that sometimes the most terrifying thing a killer can do is not just pull a trigger, but pick up a pen and tell the world his name. Case 3. The BTK Killer's Deadly Game. From the chaotic, demonic pronouncements of the Son of Sam, our folio turns to a predator of a different, more chilling variety. We travel to the heart of the American Midwest, to the quiet, unassuming city of Wichita, Kansas. Here, the horror was not born of a perceived demonic command, but from a cold, meticulous, and profoundly narcissistic desire for fame. The killer who haunted the city was not a creature of the night, but a man who lived in the bright, ordinary light of day. He was a husband, a father, a church leader, a Boy Scout troop leader. He was a man who seemed to embody the very essence of community and civic duty. But this respectable facade concealed a monster of almost unimaginable cruelty, a predator who would terrorize his city for 3 decades. He gave himself a name that was not a boast, but a brutal, technical description of his work. He was the BTK Killer, and his manifesto was a patient, decades-long game of cat and mouse with the police and the public he so desperately wanted to impress. The initials stood for his preferred method: bind, torture, kill. The story begins on the cold morning of January 15, 1974. A 15-year-old boy named Charlie Otero returned home from school to find a scene of quiet, domestic horror. His father, Joseph, his mother, Julie, and his 2 younger siblings, Josephine, 11, and Joseph Jr., 9, were all dead inside their small home. The crime was one of brutal, shocking violence. They had been bound with rope and then strangled or suffocated with plastic bags. The killer had been methodical and patient. He had spent time in the house. He had cut the phone lines. He had even eaten food from the refrigerator. The murder of an entire family plunged Wichita into a state of fear and disbelief. The police had few leads. The killer was a ghost who had left behind only his brutal handiwork and a single, chilling piece of evidence. A small amount of semen left on the scene, a signature of his perverse sexual fantasy. The case, despite a massive investigation, went cold. For the next several years, the killer remained silent, at least to the public. But he was not dormant. He was hunting. In 1974 and 1977, he struck again, killing 3 more women: Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, and Nancy Fouchine, separate, brutal attacks that followed the same pattern of binding and strangulation. He was a creature of ritual, a predator who took souvenirs from his victims and relished the act of control. Yet, he remained a phantom, his crimes linked only by their horrific similarities. The city of Wichita lived with a growing, unspoken fear, the sense of a monster moving invisibly through its quiet neighborhoods. Then, in the autumn of 1974, after the Otero murders, the killer decided he was no longer content to be a ghost. He craved recognition. He wanted a name. He went to the Wichita Public Library and, in a book on engineering, he placed a letter. He then made an anonymous call to a local newspaper reporter, telling him where to find it. The letter was a taunt. It took credit for the Otero murders, providing details that only the killer could know. It was rambling, filled with grammatical errors, and a profound, narcissistic arrogance. "I'm sorry this happened to society," he wrote. "It's a monster in me. I can't control it." He proposed a name for himself, the BTK Strangler. He had branded himself just as the Zodiac had done. He was no longer just a murderer. He was a character in a story he himself was writing. He continued his one-sided correspondence. He would leave letters taped to stop signs in library books and mailed directly to local television stations. In one letter, he chillingly asked, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national recognition?" This was the core of his motivation. The killing was the means, but the fame was the end. He was not just committing crimes. He was building a legacy, a monument to his own dark celebrity. He sent a poem, "Oh, Death to Nancy," a twisted ode to his last victim, Nancy Fox, to a local newspaper. It was a grotesque work of art from a man who saw murder as a creative act. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he fell silent. After 1979, the letters stopped. The killings seemed to cease. The city of Wichita and the police began to believe that the BTK killer had either died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or simply moved away. The case grew cold, a dark chapter in the city's history that seemed to be closed, if not solved. The years turned into a decade, then 2. A new generation grew up in Wichita knowing of the BTK legend, but it was a ghost story, a tale from the past. The man behind the mask, however, had not gone anywhere. He was living among them, a wolf in the most mundane of sheep's clothing. His name was Dennis Rader. He was married with 2 children. He had a steady job, working first for an ADT security companion detail of Supreme, dark irony, and later as a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita. His job was to enforce municipal codes, to measure the length of grass and cite people for minor infractions. He was a petty tyrant in a government polo shirt. He was also a deacon at his local Lutheran church, the president of the church council, and a Cub Scout leader. He was the picture of civic virtue, a man so deeply embedded in the fabric of his community that he was utterly invisible. While his murders had stopped, his fantasy life had not. He was meticulously maintaining his BTK persona in secret. He kept detailed files on his crimes, which he called his projects. He had a collection of his victims' driver's licenses and personal items, trophies from his kills. He would engage in elaborate autoerotic rituals, dressing up in the masks and clothing of his victims, reliving his crimes in the privacy of his own home. He was a predator in hibernation, his ego dormant but not dead. In 2004, a local newspaper ran a story on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. The article mentioned the cold case, the BTK legend, and the belief that the killer was long gone. For Dennis Rader, a man whose entire criminal career was built on a craving for recognition, this was an intolerable insult. The world had forgotten him. His legacy was fading. He decided it was time to remind them, he decided to reopen the game. In March 2004, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle. The envelope contained a copy of the driver's license of Vicki Wegerle, a woman who had been murdered in her home in 1986, a crime that had never been officially linked to BTK. It also contained photographs of her body at the crime scene, pictures that only the killer could have taken. The letter was signed with the familiar, chilling BTK symbol. The ghost had returned. The city of Wichita was plunged back into a state of terror. The monster they thought was gone was still among them. The police, led by Lieutenant Ken Landwehr of the Wichita Police Department, a detective who had been haunted by the BTK case for his entire career, knew this was their last, best chance to catch him. A new era of technology had dawned since the 1970s, and they hoped this would give them the edge they had lacked before. Rader, for his part, was ecstatic. He was back in the headlines. He began a new, more intense game of cat and mouse with the police and the media. He sent a series of packages, each one more elaborate and taunting than the last. He sent puzzles, word searches, and cryptic clues. He sent a chapter list for a book he was writing about his life, the BTK story. He left packages in cereal boxes on the side of the road, then called news stations to tell them where to find them. He was a master of self-promotion, a serial killer acting as his own publicist. His arrogance, fueled by a lifetime of getting away with it, would be his undoing. He began to believe he was intellectually superior to the police in every way. He saw the investigation not as a threat, but as a game he was certain he could win. The communication escalated. He began to ask the police direct questions. In one now infamous communication, he sent a letter asking if he could communicate with them via a floppy disk without being traced. "Be honest," he wrote. The police saw their opening. It was a stunningly naive question from a man who considered himself a genius. They decided to play his game. They took out a classified ad in the newspaper, the method BTK had suggested for a response. The ad read, simply, "Rex, it will be okay." It was a message that the police would be honest, that they could be trusted. It was, of course, a lie. Rader, seeing the ad and believing his own hype, took the bait. On February 16, 2005, he sent a padded envelope to a local television station. Inside was a single 3.5-inch floppy disk. He believed that he had wiped the disk of any identifying information. He was wrong. The disk was rushed to a forensic computer lab. The analysts quickly found what Rader had missed. Hidden in the metadata of a deleted Microsoft Word document on the disk was the key that would unlock the entire mystery. The document had last been modified by a user named Dennis, and the location where the document had been created was listed as Christ Lutheran Church. The detectives now had a first name and a location. They quickly cross-referenced the church's staff and leadership with every man named Dennis in their vast database of suspects. One name immediately jumped out: Dennis Rader, the church council president. He was a man who lived in Park City, who fit the general physical description, and who drove the type of vehicle seen near one of the package drop locations. The pieces were slamming into place with breathtaking speed. The final, definitive piece of evidence they needed was his DNA. They knew from the 1974 Otero crime scene that they had the killer's genetic profile. To get a sample from Rader without alerting him, they obtained a warrant to test a Pap smear sample that had been taken years earlier from his daughter, who was a student at Kansas State University. The familial DNA was a match. The science was irrefutable. Dennis Rader, the church president, the compliance officer, the family man, was the BTK killer. On February 25, 2005, 31 years after his first murder, the game finally came to an end. As Dennis Rader drove home from work, he was pulled over by a swarm of police cars. He was calm, almost confused. "Why am I being stopped?" he asked the officer. He was placed under arrest. In the interrogation room, faced with the overwhelming DNA evidence, his carefully constructed world collapsed. The denials quickly gave way to a full, boastful, and chillingly detailed confession. He spoke for over 30 hours, recounting each of his 10 confirmed murders with a cold, procedural detachment, as if he were describing a successful work project. He showed no remorse, only a profound pride in his work. His arrest and confession sent a shockwave not just through Wichita, but through the entire country. The monster who had haunted them for a generation was not a shadowy drifter, but their neighbor. He was the man who enforced their ordinances, the man who led their church council meetings. The ordinariness of his evil was its most terrifying feature. Dennis Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing, he was given the opportunity to speak. He delivered a rambling, arrogant, and utterly unrepentant statement, a final manifesto from the man who had craved the spotlight for so long. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would die in prison. The story of the BTK killer is a profound study in the pathology of narcissism. His letters and packages were not the cries of a tortured soul, but the press releases of a man engaged in a decades-long marketing campaign for his own brand of terror. He killed for the attention it brought him. He hid in the banality of suburban life, his public identity as a good citizen the perfect camouflage for the monster that lurked beneath. His final, fatal mistake was underestimating the very technology that had emerged during his long silence. He was a killer from the age of typewriters who was caught by the ghost in a floppy disk. His 3-decade-long manifesto ultimately providing the final, damning chapter of his own story. Case 4. Jack the Ripper's From Hell letter. From the meticulously documented modern taunts of the BTK killer, our folio now retreats into the past, into the gaslit, fog-shrouded labyrinth of Victorian London. It is here we encounter the genesis of the modern serial killer, a phantom who would not only terrorize a city, but would create a mythology so powerful it endures to this day. He was a creature of the shadows, a predator who hunted the most vulnerable in the city's darkest, most desperate corners. He gave himself no name, but the one bestowed upon him by a single, blood-soaked letter would become the most infamous in the annals of crime. This is the story of Jack the Ripper, and the horrifying manifesto that was not written in ink, but delivered in a small cardboard box. The autumn of 1888 was a time of stark, brutal contrasts in London. In the city's west, an empire presided over a quarter of the globe, its wealth and power on full display in grand new buildings and the opulent lifestyles of its ruling class. But just a few miles to the east, in the district of Whitechapel, a different reality festered. Whitechapel was a human sewer, a sprawling, overcrowded slum of narrow, unlit alleyways, teeming gin palaces, and squalid lodging houses. It was a world of profound poverty, disease, and desperation. For the women who lived here, life was a constant, brutal struggle for survival. Many were forced into alcoholism and part-time prostitution simply to earn enough money for a bed for the night. They were the city's forgotten, the invisible casualties of the industrial age. It was in this desperate, shadowy world that a new kind of terror began to walk. The killings began in August. The first victim was Mary and Polly Nichols. Her body was found in a dark lane, her throat slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. Just over a week later, on September 8th, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered in the backyard of a tenement building. Her throat had also been cut, but this time the killer had done something more. Her abdomen had been sliced open, and her uterus had been removed and taken from the scene. The violence was escalating. The killer was not just murdering. He was dissecting with a degree of anatomical skill that suggested he had some medical or butchering knowledge. Panic began to grip the East End. The press, with its newfound power of mass circulation, seized upon the story. The Whitechapel murders became a sensation, a lurid, terrifying serial that captivated and horrified the public. The police, led by detectives from Scotland Yard, were baffled. They were dealing with a new type of predator, one who killed without any apparent motive of robbery or personal grievance. He was a ghost who struck in the darkness and vanished, leaving behind only a trail of butchered women. As the city's fear intensified, the killer, or someone claiming to be him, decided to join the conversation. On September 27th, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. It was written in red ink, a boastful, taunting missive addressed to the boss. "Dear boss," it began. "I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled." The letter was filled with a chilling, almost playful arrogance. The author mocked the police for their incompetence and promised more violence. He referred to his knife as his funny little games. And then, in a postscript, he gave himself the name that would echo through history. "Don't mind me giving the trade name," he wrote, and then signed it, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." The letter was initially dismissed as a prank, one of hundreds that were flooding the police and press. But just 3 days later, on the night of September 30th, the killer made it clear that this was no hoax. In a single, horrifying hour, he committed 2 murders, an act of brazen audacity that came to be known as the double event. The body of Elizabeth Stride was found first, her throat cut. It appeared the killer had been interrupted during his work. Just 45 minutes later, and only a few streets away, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square. This time he had not been interrupted. Eddowes's body was savagely mutilated. Her throat was slashed, her abdomen ripped open. Her uterus and left kidney had been removed and taken by the killer. In the aftermath of the Eddowes murder, police found a clue that remains one of the case's most tantalizing and frustrating mysteries. A piece of Eddowes's blood-soaked apron was found in the doorway of a nearby tenement building. Above it, scrawled in chalk on the wall, were the words, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was this a message from the killer, a cryptic, anti-Semitic clue? Or was it merely coincidental graffiti? The police commissioner, fearing it would ignite anti-Jewish riots in the volatile East End, ordered the message to be washed away before it could be properly photographed. A decision that destroyed a crucial piece of evidence and has been debated by ripperologists for over a century. A day later, another communication arrived, this time a postcard sent to the Central News Agency. Also written in red ink, it referred to the double event. "You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow." It read, gloating about the 2 murders. It was signed, Jack the Ripper. The press published facsimiles of the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard. The name Jack the Ripper was now seared into the public consciousness. He was no longer a nameless phantom. He was a celebrity of terror, a character who had scripted his own entrance onto the world stage. For the next month, an uneasy silence fell over Whitechapel. The police presence was overwhelming. Vigilante committees patrolled the streets. But the killer was patient. The most infamous and horrifying communication was yet to come. On October 16th, George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small cardboard box in the mail. The smell emanating from the box was foul. Inside, nestled in cotton wool, was half of a human kidney, preserved in wine. The box also contained a letter, written in a semi-literate, spidery scrawl. It was a message of pure pathological horror. It began, "From hell. Mr. Lusk," the letter continued. "Sor, I send you half the kidna I took from one woman, preserved it for you, tother piece I fried and ate it was very knees. I may send you the bloody niff that took it out if you only wait a will longer." It was signed, simply, "Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." The From Hell letter was different from the others. It lacked the playful, taunting tone. It was grim, guttural, and deeply menacing. It also contained a chillingly specific piece of information. The kidney was examined by doctors, who determined it was a human kidney, likely from a female, and that it showed signs of Bright's disease, a kidney ailment. Catherine Eddowes, the victim from whom a kidney had been taken, was known to suffer from this very condition. This seemed to be irrefutable proof that this letter, and the gruesome object that accompanied it, had come from the killer himself. It was a manifesto written not in ink, but in flesh and blood. It suggested a killer who was not just a murderer, but a cannibal, a ghoul who consumed a part of his victims. The From Hell letter marked the peak of the Ripper's terror. He had communicated his ultimate contempt for society and its laws. Then, on November 9, 1888, he committed his final, most gruesome act. He murdered Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old prostitute. Unlike the other victims who were killed in public alleyways, Mary Kelly was murdered in the privacy of her own small, rented room at 13 Miller's Court. Here, safe from interruption, the killer had hours to perform his horrific work. The scene that was discovered the next morning was beyond description. Her body had been so systematically and savagely mutilated that she was barely recognizable as human. Her organs were strewn about the room, her heart taken from the scene. It was the work of a man who had descended into a final, explosive madness. And then, as suddenly and as mysteriously as he had appeared, Jack the Ripper vanished. The killing stopped. The letters ceased. The phantom of Whitechapel retreated back into the London fog, leaving behind a legacy of terror and an enduring mystery that has captivated the public imagination for over 130 years. Who was Jack the Ripper? The list of suspects, compiled over the past century, is vast and varied. It includes doctors, butchers, immigrants, and even members of the British royalty. Some of the most compelling suspects include a Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher from a respectable family, who was found drowned in the Thames shortly after the last murder. His own family suspected him, believing he was sexually insane. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. He was known to have a deep hatred of women and suffered from severe mental illness. He was a prime suspect of the lead detective at the time, but there was not enough evidence to charge him. He was eventually institutionalized. Søren Klasowski, also known as George Chapman, another Polish immigrant who was a convicted serial poisoner, having murdered 3 of his wives. He had some surgical knowledge and lived in Whitechapel during the murders. He was a strong suspect of one of the original investigators, Frederick Aberline. And countless others, from the famous painter Walter Sickert to Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The theories are endless, a testament to the enduring power of the mystery. The debate over the authenticity of the Ripper letters also continues to this day. Many modern experts believe that the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard were elaborate hoaxes created by a journalist to sensationalize the story and keep it on the front pages. This theory suggests that the name Jack the Ripper was a media invention, a brand created for a killer who had never named himself. The From Hell letter, however, is viewed by many as the most likely to be genuine due to the specific knowledge demonstrated by the inclusion of the diseased kidney. But even this is not certain. It is possible it was a medical student's morbid prank, a lucky guess that happened to align with the facts. In the end, we are left with a story built on shadows and whispers. The true identity of the killer and the true author of his manifesto are secrets that have been lost to time. Jack the Ripper was not just a murderer. He was a void. A blank space into which a terrified society projected its deepest fears about poverty, immigration, sexuality, and the darkness that lurked just beneath the veneer of Victorian propriety. His legend was forged in the crucible of a new media age where a single, taunting letter could transform a common murderer into an immortal monster. The manifesto, whether real or a hoax, was his greatest and most enduring creation. It gave a voice to the terror, a name to the nameless, and ensured that the ghost of Whitechapel would never truly die. The killer's manifesto is a direct challenge to the society it terrorizes. It is a demand to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, even in madness. From the ciphers of the Zodiac to the demonic pronouncements of the Son of Sam, from the meticulous game of BTK to the guttural horror of Jack the Ripper, these killers were not content to let their crimes speak for themselves. They needed to add their own narration to control the story. Their letters and messages are not just clues, they are the architecture of their own dark legacies, a final, chilling proof that the most dangerous weapon of all is a voice that refuses to be silent. Thank you for joining us in the Crime Folio. We hope these stories, as unsettling as they are, offer a glimpse into the complex and often terrifying motivations that drive a human being to not only kill, but to then pick up a pen and write about it. Sleep well, and perhaps take a moment to be grateful for the quiet, unwritten pages of your own life.